Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme of death metal, exploring the genre as a whole, regardless of what subgenre this track itself belongs to. We're going to be looking at a band called Supuration. This comes off of their 1993 album, The Cube. The track is called The Accomplishment. Now, it's interesting. I think this is the third time I'm going to bring up typography and expectations. This does not look like death metal to me. The title, the band logo, tells me electronic. I don't know, looks like early 3D rendering also tells me electronic. So I don't know what to expect, but that is not a death metal album cover. But, the community rarely sets me in the wrong direction, so let's dive in and see where Supuration lands on the death metal scale. The vocals are clear, but they're also very oddly produced. Interesting decision there on the drums.
I run away from my physical support when my mama closed my eyes. When my mama closed my eyes.
So that rhythm, that has been present since the beginning of the track. They're really favorable to that. They find ways to manipulate it and adapt it, but that is still the foundation to a lot of the rhythmic elements in this opening 2 minutes. Disguising a retardando here. It's still there. Really fun snare ideas there. There's a lot of cymbal diversity in the drumming. Oh, a slight imperfection there with the drums lagging behind the beat, just a hair bit. Even the vocals are getting in on the rhythm.
penetrating the tribunal of
Some nice ideas there, playing around with variation on similar bass idea. Interestingly, I'm having a tough time with the structure on this one. Everything's sort of blurring together to me, for me. What? We were working with that fade out, and I was like, okay, this is how they're gonna end the track, right? We're gonna fade this out and call it a day. Maybe we're gonna bend it a little bit and detune it and kind of have not only an audio fade volume wise, but also a pitch decrease. And then they started playing something higher. They brought the intensity back, and I was like, guys, you have 3 seconds. What are you gonna do in 3 seconds? And then they didn't do anything with that rise, with the increased intensity. They just kind of left it there, and so the song felt like it ended on a tense point. It didn't push towards um that feeling of resolution that they had just presented, which that's not a bad thing if it's what they're going for. If they want the song to feel tense, irresolute, they landed on it. But to me, coming from a classical background, it feels like someone who didn't know what they were doing. And that doesn't have to be the truth to the situation, but that's my read on it. It comes out of nowhere. It feels like a joke thrown at the end of a rather serious song. And that clash also leans into what I feel like is just a lack of experience. I'm kind of curious where this album sits in their library. Oh, they're still making music. Well, still. Their latest album's from 2015, and initially I thought, oh, that wasn't that long ago. But yeah, that's like 9 years. Where does the time go? So this looks like it was their second album, but their first album's called Promo Tape 91. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that this was probably... Oh, there's a couple of tracks in here that share names as well. So I'm going to say that this is probably their first real produced debut album, and the other one is a bunch of demos. I think it shows. This was a band that had some ideas down. I think they had a solid foundation, but a lot of room for growth. And that's sort of the idea I want y'all to keep in mind when I go through this, because I do feel like this is going to be a bit of a harsh analysis, but keeping in mind that this was their first release, and and that probably most of the issues I have with this were corrected in future releases. That's probably a good mindset to be in. I don't want to be overly harsh on them, but a band's first output usually is a bit raw and rough around the edges, and yeah, this is definitely in that area. The production is odd for death metal. This was 93. I'm trying to keep that in mind. I'm trying to keep in mind this was their first album. Lots of context. It's odd, but it's refreshing. It's missing the meat of a lot of death metal. It's missing. Well, let me go about this a different way. Instead of saying what it isn't, let me describe what it is. It is plenty of thin instruments barely filling up a lot of space on their own. They do come together to create a rather large sound for how thin most of the individual instruments are. But it is very clear that there's little, if any, crossover in placement. For instance, when the drummer chooses not to play cymbals, or when they do that odd syncopated closed hi-hat fill, you absolutely feel the void that the cymbals leave. They're the only instrument in that area of the mix. The same is true for everything. When the bass isn't playing, the song feels top heavy. When the vocalist isn't growling, the left speaker is a bit empty. Everything has a very specific placement in the song with very little overlap. So when they're not present, the song feels imbalanced. It's an interesting production choice that I think could absolutely work. I don't want to say that it doesn't here. It could be that it's all intentional. It could be that the drummer specifically wants this gap, this vacuum to happen when he chooses not to play a specific part of the drum kit. I don't know. It certainly felt. I found it to be distracting. It took me out of the song more than it gave me a specific feeling while being in the song, but that doesn't mean that they did it wrong either. That's just my experience with it, and some people are going to really love it. There were some parts where I found the vacuum to be a positive experience, but for the most part, it was a frictional component. The production feels just a bit too rough for me. I feel like every single instrument could be given just a little bit more width in order to cover just a little bit more room in the sphere, in the sound sphere, in the song itself. It's not a bad choice. It's just different. On the production side as well, the vocals I feel are very underproduced, which is interesting because we went over this yesterday too. I don't remember which band it was. Was it Tomb Mold? It must have been Tomb Mold. Where I felt like the vocals were completely raw, almost no production put on them at all. I could even hear the unique characteristics and timbre of the microphone, at least it sounded like to me. I'm getting something here as well. It feels like a single vocal track. It's not double tracked at all, and it feels rather raw. It just feels like this dude's growling in my ear. There's no extra effects put on it. It feels like there's very little EQ put on it. It's just a growl. And so, compared to modern death metal, it does feel underdeveloped. It's one of those areas where I think that growling production techniques, much like how producers learn to EQ and mix and produce all sorts of music over time. You know, when the electric guitar came in, I'm sure it felt underproduced compared to modern electric guitar. Times have changed, standards have changed, all sorts of things in the music sphere outside of the composition and performance itself have changed. And I think this just might be one of them. It's interesting because I get to hear a rather dry version of the vocals themselves, but I don't find it to be a positive listening experience, and that's probably because my ears are adjusted to modern death production. So yeah, the whole production on this thing is interesting, but I don't want to fault it too much because of all the context around it. Not to mention it is 1993, and the types of production, standards for production, and even the technology used for production have changed drastically over the last 30 years. Is that where the 90s are at now? Yeah, 30 years. So it's not really fair to judge modern production against older production. But it is something I felt consistently through this track. Just my experience with music is that a lot of this feels undercooked to me with a modern ear. Moving on to the compositional side, though, I found this to be too repetitive. I'm curious where death metal fans fall on this. Death metal as a whole can be a genre that I find to be a bit too repetitive at times, but this feels more so, and I'm wondering if anybody else grew tired of what was going on in here. Particularly, I just don't feel like the 7 minutes were justified. It's sort of clear to me. Again, structure is kind of rough for me because a lot of this blended together, but I think we have a verse, chorus, bridge with guitar solo, verse, chorus. The typical A B A B C A B pattern that bands like Metallica have massively popularized during their thrash eras. I think that's what's going on here, and that's what pushes the length so far. But it just never feels justified. I know when that core riff that we had in our opening verse comes back in at like the 6 minute mark, I was like, oh man, this again. It wasn't a return to, it's like, yeah, we're getting back to this, that whatever, I just wasn't into it. That's sort of how I felt through a lot of this track. It just never really picks up. A lot of the riffage feels trite, especially to a modern listener. This is stuff that uh, if I hadn't heard some of these things coming into it, I definitely had heard them by the 6 minute mark. I've heard a lot of them by the 6 minute mark. And it's one of those things, again, I'm trying to keep in perspective. Have I heard ideas like this that came after the Cube? Is that why it feels trite to me? Were they, on the cusp of the bleeding edge? And this stuff was new. I don't know what the musical landscape of death metal felt like in 1993. So it's really tough for me to put that in perspective. But I think the worst part is the it's a double-edged sword here, right? The rhythm. Bump, 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 bump. That rhythm is everywhere in the song, and I love that. It's very cool for them to create this foundational idea and run with it, create variations upon it, adapt it to other ideas. When we came to, I think it was the fourth riff in there, and I pointed it out, I wonder how many of you felt that rhythm there. It was a brand new riff, unlike anything we had heard up to that point, and the accent points were still generally along this same beat. It's very cool for them to expand upon it like this and explore basically a rhythmic motif in a drastically different series of riffs and musical ideas. I'm a huge fan of that. but I don't think the variation was enough to justify hearing it predominantly for 7 minutes long. I would have liked to hear maybe a little bit more variation on it, or to ditch it in a few places and explore a different rhythmic idea in order to create juxtaposition and contrast to it. It definitely began to grate on me, and again, after we had a small, very small moment away from it, and we returned back to it around the 6 minute mark, hitting that final verse again, I was definitely done with it. And that's ultimately where I stand on this, is there are some really cool ideas. The execution is just underwhelming for me, and part of that is the time period. It's the difference between then and now. But part of it is also, I think, built into the composition of it, where it is one idea. You really have to be on board with what they're doing within the first minute, because if you're not, you're going to be hearing a lot of that thing you don't really enjoy. And that's where I landed on this. I'm really curious to see where they went from here. Maybe even just one album later and see how that expanded. But certainly, I'm curious what they did with their latest album. Maybe their last. Again, that was almost a decade ago. Maybe they're out of the game now. I'm curious to see how they expanded on this. Let me hear some lyrics. Alright, so lyrically, there's some interesting ideas here, but much like the music, I feel it's just a hair bit undercooked. Although that just might be me because I don't fully understand what's going on. There is, well, the first, let me just point this out, it's free poetry. I don't see a rhyme scheme, I don't see a rhythm or a meter to it. It's just a collection of sentences, sometimes strung together and sometimes seemingly disparate. It seems to be about somebody who has died and is being judged for rebirth. That's my guess here. He says, I know I'm not lost. I know my journey hasn't ended. I don't even know my own destiny. I do know the sphere has come to save me. If I'm immaterial, if I'm only a regard, it's because I've left the body which I gave life. I ran away from my physical support when my mother closed my eyes. In my spherical disguise, I feel free from my lost anguishes. Flashes which made me suffer are now only recollections. Slowly the globe makes its first cut into the exit, carrying me away. The inner sides of the cube has not altered yet, and no pain comes to hurt me. Wandering in the labyrinth through 1,000 ways, sensations, emotions, and ideas, I'm concentrating on myself by suppressing all obstacles of my pure intuition. Now, I read this all as one collected group because Metal Archives doesn't have any stanza breaks in it, but I don't think all of this came through directly in the lyrics. I'm curious what sections are supposed to be read in isolation and in separation from the others. But the idea here is that they become a sphere because the sphere saves them. Maybe they get into it? I don't know. He says the sphere has come to save me, and a few lines later says, in my spherical disguise. I suppose they could have stepped into the sphere and are disguised in that way. But getting into the sphere, they move through a labyrinth. There's so many sensations and feelings that they have, ideas coming to them. But despite that, they concentrate just on themselves by suppressing all obstacles of my pure intuition. The last lines here are the ones that lead me to the element of rebirth. It says, I've been analyzed and judged worthy to live again. The sphere comes to illuminate me My journey will end when I rejoin the light. I suppose that is an accomplishment. To have been to have died and been deemed worthy enough for a second chance. But I don't really understand anything that happens in this afterlife. It's a hodgepodge of ideas, locations, visuals that don't say much to me. It's all just a hair bit too vague. Some nice ideas, like I mentioned, there's sparkling, there's diamonds in the rough. It's just, you really have to sift through to find it. I really think, much like the music, with some more time in the oven, more experience under the band's belt, Supuration could create some really cool stuff. But this debut album of theirs it just doesn't quite grab me. But those are just my thoughts on Suppuration's The Accomplishment. What are yours? Let me know in the comments what you thought about this. Die-hard death metal fans, is this better than I'm giving it credit for? Is it just that I'm too young to really appreciate this? Which is funny because I was alive when this came out. I was young when it came out, but it's not like this is before my time. But you get the gist of it, right? I have a modern ear. I'm not trying to hide that. I've never tried to hide it. I really dig modern sounds and production. And this is sort of the antithesis to that, both maybe in intention, but also due to it just being 30 years old. I don't know, just let me know your thoughts on it. Your opinions, your perspectives. As usual, I'm open for conversation. If you think I'm wrong in any of this, let me know. We'll open a dialogue and I'll try to see your perspective on it. As usual, I don't ever think I'm some authority up here. I'm just giving you my perspective, and that's one person's. I need more to fully appreciate something. Above the description box Above the comment section is a description box. In there you'll find a link to Linktree. It'll take you here, which... Oh my jeez. Yeah, it'll take you here. Wow. Okay. This is Linktree. This is my Linktree. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell, I suppose for the second time in this outro. I greatly appreciate all three of those. We do have a rather lengthy track coming up next as a special selection. It is a quasi-album review, I suppose. It is one 40-minute song, but it's also the only song on the album. So I guess that's a little way to find a loophole in the system and get me to do an album review not on a Saturday. It is like 41 minutes, though, if that interests you. I don't know what kind of music it is. Check that out. It's next up today. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow. We're going to wrap this week's theme up and explore something else after. I haven't figured out what we're doing on Friday yet. Definitely wrapping up death metal, though. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, with the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.